Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this third session of the Beyond Global Violence Initiative, Fall Colloquium. Today, this session will be presided by Professor João Cesar de Castro Rocha from the State University of Rio de Janeiro, a specialist in comparative literature and an expert in mimetic theory. So all of you are mostly welcome here, students and scholars from Boston College and people following us through streaming. Yesterday, Professor de Castro Rocha helped us to analyze an aspect of the war mode that humanity is experiencing on a global scale through his proposal of hate rhetoric to understand the rationality that underlies the politics of the extreme right as a transitional strategy, transnational strategy to control social networks, as well as social and political movements in order to protect the interests of the hegemonic world. Through examples of the narrative of hate in Rwanda, in relation to other narratives of social and political polarization in the contemporary world, both in Brazil and the United States and several other European countries, Professor de Castro Rocha was weaving a plausible hypothesis on the rhetoric of hate as a process to make the other invisible. With constant allusions to literary narratives that tell the story of violent mimesis, the internal logic of social and ideological polarization that characterizes social networks became apparent. The conversation with the audience yesterday flowed with a wealth of intuitions, ideas, and new issues to deepen the understanding of the rhetoric of hate. I highlight two that seem pertinent in our context here at BC. How to think the violent mimesis generated by the rhetoric of hate in other cultural contexts, such as Chinese. How to promote alternatives to the rhetoric of hate based on the social and cultural resistances generated by other modes of communication in the media sphere. Today, in his second lecture, Professor de Castro Rocha will continue his analysis on social networks as a Girardian phenomenon. I wish to emphasize that we are witnessing here a thought in process, a kind of laboratory, right, Professor de Castro Rocha? A laboratory of ideas that corresponds to the objective of this colloquium and of the Beyond Global Violence Initiative. The lectures delivered at Boston College are part of a forthcoming book in progress, sitting the conclusion of his most recent book, Shakespearean Cultures, Latin American and the Challenges of Mimesis in Nonviolent Circumstances. I would like to introduce and welcome Professor de Castro. This is the greatest challenge of mimesis, to recognize oneself in this other, who from our non-hegemonic vantage point, we know to be another possible I. I give the floor to Professor de Castro Rocha, who will expound his thoughts on mimetic theory and the digital universe, interdividuality as an alternative. Let's welcome again our guest.
Good evening. Let me start by thanking heartily Carlos Mendoza, a very good friend for more than 10 years, and a companion in so many enterprises and intellectual projects. Many thanks, Carlos. It's a great honor and a great joy to be here in the Boston College and to have the chance to present to you some new ideas. More than a formal lecture, I would like to think together with you concerning mainly two issues: mimetic theory and the digital universe. I will read the paper to make it shorter, and I will try to speak no more than 40-45 minutes so that we have more time to dialogue. And again, this is a new hypothesis. You feel, please, absolutely free to raise questions, remarks, and above all, criticisms. Do you have the image? Please. And many thanks for coming. In the beginning was fake news. Let me start
with one image, the only one I will be sharing with you today. And let us try to forget the profusion of mistakes in this laughable English. The true question is how such a coarse counterfeit may deceive someone. Sigmund Freud's 1927 essay, The Future of an Illusion, helps us to understanding this disquieting circumstance. As you remember, Freud distinguishes clearly between error, mistake, and illusion. And I quote, "An illusion is not the same thing as an error, nor it is necessarily an error. Aristotle's belief that vermin are developed out of dung, a belief to which ignorant people still cling, was an error. So was the belief of a former generation of doctors that tabes dorsalis is the result of sexual excess. It would be incorrect to call these mistakes illusions. On the other hand, it was an illusion of Columbus that he had discovered a new sea route to the Indies. The part played by his wish in this mistake is very clear. The key point here is that an illusion can only exist if there is a wish involved in it. In other words, a mistake may be objectively identified and then corrected. However, an illusion implies the subjective projection of one's own desire onto reality. And then we cannot simply correct it, for we cannot dismiss someone else's desires and wishes. We could only attempt at doing so in a pre-Freudian world when the unconscious was not yet acknowledged as one of the driving forces of human culture and therefore of individual life. Now we can take the image. It's a horrible image, bothers me. Thank you, Carlos. In the sequence of the argument, Freud introduces a new notion to which I will return in the end of our conversation. Says Freud, what is characteristic of illusions is that they are derived from human wishes. In this respect, they come near to psychiatric delusions, but they differ from them. In the case of delusions, we emphasize as essential their being in contradiction with reality. Illusions need not necessarily be false, that is to say, unrealizable or in contradiction to reality. This triad, mistake, illusion, delusion, will help me to conclude our conversation, and above all, may be instrumental in the development of a new theoretical framework, precisely the work I'm engaged with, and whose first step, the replacement of the notion of hate speech with the concept of hate rhetoric we discussed yesterday. Let us then move step by step. I'm just trying out with you some ideas. In the contemporary world, our lives seems to become ever more Girardian, that is to say, following the mimetic theory developed by the French thinker René Girard. That is to say, our lives seem to become more and more mimetic, and especially if we do not realize it. This is true to such an extent that even everyday language speaks of this circumstance. I think especially of a tool which is omnipresent in our societies. One just has to listen carefully to the concepts employed daily by billions of users of the digital universe, and more particularly, users of social networks, to consider the strength of mimetic theory in an attempt to come to grips with the challenges of our current situation. We all and let me emphasize this point, we all want our posts and tweets and photos to become viral. We all have lost some precious time looking at an infinity of memes and TikTok videos. In political science, there is even a new approach, Mimetic, specialized in the study of the production of memes, and above all, in the understanding the overwhelming impact of their reception, notably in the political arena. Among so many possible examples, the Italian movement Cinque Stelle, 5 stars, the election of Donald J. Trump in the United States, and Jair Messias Bolsonaro in Brazil, the outcome of the Brexit plebiscite, are events intrinsically, although not exclusively, related to a sort of mass production of memes and other gadgets typical of social networks, whose high level of engagement is changing dramatically the world of politics. And that's not all. The word contagion is commonly employed by users of social networks in almost the technical sense of René Girard's mimetic contagion. The paroxysm of internal mediation also accompanies the mimetic drive underlying the digital universe, widening in an unprecedented form the scope of a historical process which dates back to the 18th century. I will be deliberately telegraphic in remembering you that in the unfolding of mimetic theory, René Girard envisaged 2 forms of mediation of desire, which always consists desire in a triangular relationship involving the subject who adopts a model, whom guides the subject in his desire for given objects. So we always have a subject, model, object type of relationship with a myriad of possibilities. If subject and model are not in the same level, that is to say, if they are not physically close to each other, then their relationship is defined as external mediation. And given the spatial or temporal distance between them, naturally they cannot engage in rivalries towards the same objects. The imitatio Christi is the paradigm of external mediation. Internal mediation, on the contrary, tends to lead to mimetic rivalries and the unavoidable escalation of violence, because subject and model are on the same level. They coexist in the same time and space. Therefore, if the subject adopts objects desired by the model as his own object of desire, at a certain point, they will necessarily engage in an actual fight for the possession of the objects. This is the world created in Girardian terms in the aftermath of the French Revolution, 1789, and modern and contemporary historical periods have only increased the potential violence implied in the omnipresence of internal mediation, for the absence of rigid hierarchies invents a world where all is possible and available to all, a world envisaged by Dostoevsky. This phenomenon was aggravated by the omnipresence of social networks, an authentic laboratory of mimetic relationships and predicaments. In this context, what to say of a new profession which is flourishing nowadays? I am referring to the digital influencer, an expression which is completely Girardian. So I'm referring to the digital influencer, whose only possible parallel is given by the uncontrollable multiplication of coaches for every single aspect of life. There are even coaches to teach you to become a coach. The reader of René Girard's fundamental work cannot but close her eyes and anticipate the next step. Digital influencers and coaches are only successful if they present themselves as a scandalon to billions of users around the globe. In technical Girardian terms, scandalon means that you offer yourself as a desirable model, and therefore you cannot but produce rivalries. In other words, you are making people envious of your situation. This is a scandalon in a Girardian technical term. In other words, the lifestyle of digital influencers and coaches, although seemingly inaccessible, or precisely because of it, become the explicit object of desire of their followers. And the concept of follower itself is as mimetic as it gets. Thus, Girardian concepts come naturally to mind. Metaphysical desire, a key concept in mimetic theory, defines the profile of such followers. The urgent desire of being what the other, admired by so many, is. As a coach or a digital influencer, you have to induce metaphysical desire in your followers, or you are not going to profit from your projected image. The double-bind nature of this predicament is a perfect recipe for the escalation of symbolic violence and abusive language which permeates the digital universe. Influencers and coaches are active, known readers of Gregory Bateson's fundamental concept of double-bind because they urge their followers to adopt them as indisputable models. But at the same time, precisely because they are coaches and influencers, they are making it clear that the followers will not be able to achieve what nonetheless they are led to covet because of the same influencers and coaches. Otherwise, if followers could become coaches, if all followers could become coach and influencer, we would live in a world of coaches and influencers with no followers available. But if there are no followers, then how could there be coaches and influencers? You understand that redundancy imposes itself here because redundancy is a powerful mimetic machine. In Bateson's words, the double bind is, and I quote, a situation in which no matter what a person does, he cannot win. It is hypothesized that a person caught in the double bind may develop schizophrenic symptoms. This is the famous essay by Gregory Bateson on the understanding of schizophrenic being developed through behavior circumstances. Toward a theory of schizophrenia is the essay. It is the case because in a double bind situation, you are prompted at doing something. But in the course of action, you are prohibited and sometimes violently to do so. The contradiction only gets worse because you are not allowed to voice your disagreement with the obvious contradiction. Do it, don't do it. You cannot verbalize your discomfort. A brief note, important to the project led by Carlos Mendoza Alvarez. This predicament, that is, in the double bind, being deprived of language, being unable to produce narratives, is what ultimately closes the vicious circle, which may result in schizophrenic symptoms. Without one's own room and own voice, we would all become infants. And mind the etymology, infants, the one who does not have language, the one who does not talk, and therefore cannot know about himself. The paradox structure implied in the double bind evokes the classic situation in the fable. in which the character who desires everything gets nothing. After all, finding himself midway between two treasures, he is unable to settle on one for fear of losing the other. This is, I propose, a conflictive situation rendered properly dramatic by the dynamics of the digital universe, as I will propose in the conclusion of this lecture, of this conversation. The best is yet to come. This unprecedented escalation of mimetic rivalry, and therefore mimetic violence in daily basis and on a planetary scale, although seemingly in trite matters, has a shocking outcome. The obsessive repetition of the mimetic resolution offered by the so-called virtual lynching, which happens all the time in social networks. The omnipresence of the cancel or call out culture, an obvious variation of the scapegoat mechanism, widely employed and with an absolute méconnaissance of its motivation. This is a key issue. As you also remember, this is a key concept to understand the dynamics of the scapegoat mechanism, méconnaissance. And according to Girard, the Christian lesson to the world is to break up with méconnaissance. Méconnaissance is fundamental because to understand the concept of the scapegoat mechanism, you have to understand that we can only have a scapegoat if we do not know that the victim is being used as a channel to the escalation of mimetic violence. Instead of bringing an entire group to an entropic situation, the mimetic violence is channeled against only one member of the group, the scapegoat. That is the reason why when a mob scapegoats someone, in the very act of scapegoating, the perpetrators are convinced, they have to be convinced that the person being killed is actually guilty. The digital universe has this disquieting side effect, the triumphant return of the méconnaissance, as if we are thrown back to a pre-Christian worldview. I do not have a theological background, so this is a topic which deserves a reflection from my theologian friends, from you. I've just given the suggestion, but it really impresses me tremendously. Méconnaissance has returned, as if we are in a pre-Christian world, and we do not realize it. Of course, I'm not alluding here to an impressive mimetic rivalry between two nation states, France and Germany in the 19th century, or the United States and China in the 21st century. I'm not considering a surprising mimetic rivalry between two remarkable men, Karl von Clausewitz and Napoleon Bonaparte, according to René Girard's sharp observations in his fascinating dialogue with Benoît Chantre, Archevêque Clausewitz, translated into English as Bearing to the End, a perfect title to convey the dangers implied in a world in which mimetic desire seems to have been unleashed in the midst of méconnaissance. Rather, if you may, I am taking into consideration petty, little, small, everyday life rivalries concerning almost everything and certainly nothing. Gustave Flaubert dreamed of writing a novel about nothing, that is, a novel whose true content would be its own style, its own literary form. Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David launched one of the most successful sitcoms ever, Seinfeld, developed around the notion that the show was about nothing. I think some of the students are too young to have seen Seinfeld. I'm sorry. They also succeeded, Seinfeld and Larry David, in creating what probably is the quintessence of mimetic desire in popular culture. That would be a fascinating course for you to teach to your students, to select 3 or 4 episodes by Seinfeld and make a mimetic analysis of it. The digital universe perversely brought Flaubert's dream into full fruition. Most of the times, the explosion of mimetic violence in social networks seems to have no real cause. Or shall we say that the true cause is the dynamics of the mimetic mechanism. It is mimetism itself in its sheer power which provokes the outburst of symbolic violence with which we have gotten used to, and we have to acknowledge it. In other words, Achev Clausewitz, battling to the end, is here and now, in the temporality invented by the digital universe. Hic et nunc, yet derived, as Walter Benjamin put it, nowness. This temporality is what I'm trying to understand, how to come to terms with it. What are its consequences? Let us then read together 4 neglected passages of Mensonge Romantique, a Vérité Romanesque, translated into English as Deceit, Desire in the Novel. And a brief footnote. In technical terms, Mensonge Romantique means that you do not acknowledge the presence of a mediator to your desire. Rather, you are in Mensonge Romantique, in a romantic lie, if you believe that you are the master of your own desire. Rather, Vérité Romanesque, the truth brought by the novel, is that you acknowledge that there isn't love at first sight, that there is always a model, there is always a mediator to your own desire. So, Mensonge Romantique, Vérité Romanesque. Let's read 4 passages of Mensonge Romantique, Vérité Romanesque. Chivalric literature, ever more spread since the invention of the printing press, multiplies stupendously the chances of similar unions. Desire, according to the other, and the seminal function of literature are also found in the novels of Flaubert. Second quote, travelers, tales, books, and the press bring the latest fashions of the capital, Paris, even to Yonville. Third quote, these mysterious words, poetic and incomprehensible, have a powerful effect on the mind of Marcel. The printed word has a magical power of suggestion, and the author never tires of giving us examples of it. As in the previous novelists, oral and literary suggestions lend each other mutual support. So 4 neglected fundamental messages, according to my perspective, of the Girard's first book. In a deservedly famous essay, Elizabeth Eisenstein considered the printing press as an agent of change. René Girard clearly saw the printing press not as an agent, but as a powerful agency for the contagious transmission of mimetic desire through the printing press. It is then not casual that the first stone of his cathedral, as Jean-Pierre Dupuy called the mimetic theory, a cathedral, is an inspiring analysis of the suggestive force of the printed book. I can be more precise. Girard sees the printing press as a mimetic tool, which has exponentially favored the process of displacement of external to internal mediation. Printed books could render objects and positions equally desirable by social actors from radically different backgrounds, bring them to the same time and space through the act of reading. They are brought to the same time and space as subjects that otherwise could only entertain an external mediation. You already see my point. Social networks demand that we ask ourselves, réel mensonge romantique, vérité romanesque, would be either contained or unleashed through the usage of digital universe as a powerful mimetic tool. The most powerful ever made available to the dissemination of mimetic rivalries, violent crises, and internal mediation. Then we may understand why the most sophisticated means of communication, able to produce an unheard of simultaneity of action, transmission of the action, reception of the action which has not yet been concluded, can only solve the crisis it produces, resorting to the most primitive solution, the scapegoat mechanism. So our contemporary crisis is that we're bringing together the most sophisticated and the most primitive, the digital universe and the scapegoat mechanism. Time to try to characterize the temporality of the digital universe. The digital universe and social networks inaugurated, I propose, this is my main hypothesis, so let's try to think through together. An unprecedented simultaneity of three dimensions, which in the past were clearly distinguished. Nowadays, through the simultaneity propitiated by the digital media, an action occurs and the transmission of the action takes place at the exact moment of its occurrence, before it has been concluded, which in its turn also coincides with the reception of the action transmitted before its conclusion. The radical verticality of this experience tends to replace interpretation for emotional responses in the heat of the moment. The finger, so to speak, becomes the protagonist of the communicative system. After all, we are in the digital universe. Digital comes from the Latin, to finger. To a large extent, the ostensive aggressiveness of social networks is related to this simultaneity of three different moments, which of course invites an equally simultaneous response that is immediate to reception, which in its turn had been immediate to the action itself before its conclusion. This is not human. Only a machine is able to process this simultaneity of three different levels of human interaction. In this infernal circle, whose watermark is the indistinction between times, gestures, and intentions, chaos is engendered without pause. And Carlos, pause is all we need. All we need is pause. In a possible archaeology of this circumstance, I will study two key events for the future book, very briefly. First of all, the beginning of the Gulf War, which was announced in advance. If Saddam Hussein did not accept the ultimatum to leave Kuwait by midnight on January 15th, 1991, a devastating air attack would be launched. Similar ultimatums have occurred countless times throughout history, of course. However, now, for the first time, an unprecedented fact has taken place. The starting of the bombings was broadcast live on CNN. For the first time in history, we all connected on a television to wait the future to begin. And its coverage lasted 24 hours a day. Just like the character Funes el Memorioso from the short story by Jorge Luis Borges. This is a character who could not forget one single thing that he had done in the previous day. So if you would meet Funes and say, "Hi, Funes, how was your day yesterday?" You'd have to put apart 24 hours of your day because he would tell you everything that happened. So Funes el Memorioso, who, because he could not forget anything, he could not think anymore. And even worse, in the short story, he dies of a congestion. CNN's coverage perfectly conveys the atmosphere of excitement and chaos that prefigured the dystopian universe of social media today. We're always anxious to know what is still going to happen next minute. Isn't that so? The second event takes us to September 11th, 2001. Once again, we all saw on live TV the crash of an airplane that smashed itself into the first of the Twin Towers in New York. For long, eternal minutes, commentators tried to understand what had happened, as it seemed impossible to imagine reasons for the disaster. How could a pilot get so disoriented that he collided with the most famous skyline in the world? How could he collide with the skyscraper in the city center? Would he have fainted mid-flight, or would a mechanical failure have left the plane adrift? Out of the blue, a hermeneutic short circuit hits everyone, without exception, all over the world, because a second aircraft collides in a clearly purposeful way against the second tower. It is worth watching the video carefully. It's about not even 10 minutes between the first and the second airplane. Rarely has the hermeneutic collapse produced by the simultaneity of action, transmission, reception been so eloquently reviewed. And mind that the action is transmitted before its conclusion. Martin Ames, the British novelist, said it all in one cutting sentence. It was the appearance of the second plane. There was a decisive moment. Only then the hypothesis of a terrorist attack seriously was raised by commentators. The time span, I propose, between the first and second planes truly inaugurated the 21st century and was still entrapped into those 8 minutes. Hermeneutics itself as a discipline demands the temporal distance between the interpreter's present and the singular time of the artifact to be analyzed. If they were, interpreter and object, encapsulated in the same eternal present, and therefore eternally orphaned of references, how are we supposed to perform the act of interpretation? Do not forget, for example, that Marcel Duchamp's Red Maid is unthinkable without the critical act that depends on the time gap at the participant that he needs to imagine between the usual context of the object and its recontextualization made possible by the decontextualization of its utilitarian function. Without a time gap, art is not possible. Without a time gap, without a time lag, interpretation is not possible. Without a time difference between action, transmission, and reception, human culture, as we have developed it, is not possible. It is not surprising that the digital universe follows the binary codes of exclusion and inclusion without any interpretation, It is just an identification of patterns, exclusion, inclusion, exclusion, inclusion. This temporality, in conjunction with the omnipresence of the social networks in our daily lives, has created the conditions for an unprecedented phenomenon. Let me conclude our conversation by rescuing Leon Festinger's A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance, a groundbreaking essay on social psychology published in 1957. The celebrated social psychologist devoted himself to understand how we would try to reconcile our beliefs with our acts. After all, what defines a human being is that he is not coherent all the time. Otherwise, he would be a machine. But even machines may malfunction sometimes. The theory of cognitive dissonance sought for means to diminish the distance between action and belief. As I just proposed, digital universe and social networks have altered dramatically this circumstance. Now, it is my contention, dissonance is not avoided. This was the main point by Leon Festinger. Human beings cannot live without some level of cognitive dissonance. You may be a physician, you may smoke. As a physician, you know that smoke's not good for your health. But as a human being, you love to smoke. So you try as much as possible to shorten the cognitive dissonance, but some cognitive dissonance features our humanity. What I'm proposing is that right now, dissonance is not being avoided, but rather is being systematically produced. Cognitive dissonance in a collective level, and then I'm proposing the concept of collective cognitive dissonance, forges a distorted perception of reality, conducive to the widespread phenomenon of the multiplication of conspiracy theories in the digital universe, as well as favoring the creation of groups highly resistant to the most basic reality principle. And we all have friends who are there. Let us then see how Festinger conceptualized the phenomenon. First of all, he published in 1956 with two colleagues this fascinating book called When Prophecy Fails. He managed to be part of the Brotherhood of the Seven Rays, a group which was developed around Dorothy Martin, a resident of Chicago, who one day she began to receive messages from ETs from a distant planet called Clarion. The content of the messages was really disturbing. On December 21st, 1954, a flood of biblical proportions would destroy much of the earth. Moreover, her followers felt confident that on D-Day, a flying saucer would land in Dorothy Martin's backyard and would rescue the happy few who answered her call and believed the prophecy. The unlucky day arrived, December 21st, 1954, but also two bitter disappointments presented themselves, although the second was a relief. The flying saucer did not appear, but at least the flood also missed the scheduled the appointment. Leon Festinger and a few colleagues managed to infiltrate the sect. They were thus able to answer the key question: what happens in the dynamics of a group of fanatics when the prophecy fails? Two discoveries of great significance were made. On the one hand, the supporters of the Brotherhood did not abandon their convictions. On the contrary, they rationalized the failure of the prophecy in the following way: the announcement of the flood would have prevented its occurrence. In other words, the mental energy employed in warning the disaster was reason enough to change the action of the ETs from Clarion. On the other hand, the last sentence of the book inaugurates a radicalism for which Festinger himself was not prepared, but which exploded in our world, the 21st century. So the prophecy failed, they rationalized, and then what? Did the brotherhood disappear? Final words of the book, the 1956 book. Their ideas of the brotherhood were not without popular appeal. And they received hundreds of visitors after the prophecy had failed. Telephone calls and letters from seriously interested citizens, as well as offers of money. Events conspired to offer them a truly magnificent opportunity to grow in numbers. Had they been more effective, this confirmation, the failure of prophecy, might have portended the beginning, not the end. The vertiginous publicity generated by the spectacular failure of the prediction would make it possible to convert failure into a factor of surprising growth in an unprecedented phase of expansion of the brotherhood instead of its disappearance. Does it sound familiar in our world? My hypothesis depends upon a malicious reading, I have to acknowledge. I propose that Leon Festinger wrote a theory of cognitive dissonance to come to terms with the perplexity caused by the internal history of the brotherhood. The begging of the question is unequivocal, and I quote the 1957 book. The existence of dissonance is undoubtedly an everyday condition. As we just remembered, discrepancies between beliefs and actions define the human condition. That is why Festinger tries very hard to keep the phenomenon under control. It's a long quote. I ask you to pay attention to how redundant the quote is. The presence of dissonance gives rise to pressures to reduce or eliminate the dissonance. The strength of the pressure to reduce the dissonance is a function of the magnitude of the dissonance. In other words, dissonance acts in the same way as a state of drive or need or tension. The presence of dissonance leads to action to reduce it, just as, for example, the presence of hunger leads to action to reduce the hunger. Also similar to the action of a drive, the greater the dissonance, the greater will be the intensity of the action to reduce the dissonance, and the greater the avoidance of situations that would increase the dissonance. I don't remember to have read such a redundant phrase in an academic book, and it's a fantastic book. And it's full of italics. The italics are the authors, as is the tautological style. In this paragraph alone, the word dissonance is repeated 9 times. The anguished reiteration shows Festinger's discomfort with the fact that the failure of the prophecy did not necessarily mean the end of the brotherhood. This has become part of the contemporary world in the form of what I would like to call collective cognitive dissonance, circumstance made possible by the contagion favored by the most powerful machine of disinformation in the history of humankind, a concept I propose, the extremist media sphere. I know it sounds awkward, but it is meant to sound awkward. This is a new concept I'm proposing to your evaluation. it is a powerful machine, the extremist media sphere, for producing polarized narratives based on fake news and conspiracy theories. It is composed of 5 elements, 4 internal and 1 external, forming a complex integrated system that continuously generates radicalized content. It contains, first element, the notorious WhatsApp. Second element, the indefectible social networks. Third element, a highly toxic network of YouTube channels. And finally, some apps, like in Brazil, there is one app called TV Bolsonaro, 24/7 news and fake news on how Bolsonaro is the best president ever, as we have seen in the first image. Within this web, audiovisual production circulates without any pause, spreading radicalized belief systems. With, even more important, the members of the extremist media sphere endorse a pact that would scare Mephisto himself. You must ignore all the information that does not come from the extremist media sphere itself. You are entrapped in this ecosystem of disinformation and lies 24/7. The external element, the 5th one, is very serious. I call it the friendly media of those in power, who, by giving voice to the most lunatic fantasies, seriously destabilize democracy and stimulate, at the limit of committing crimes, the authoritarian project of the far-right political agenda. The purpose of the extremist media sphere is a creation of collective cognitive dissonance, a fearsome electoral machine by transferring the high intensity of social media engagement to politics. The politicized the polis is the road to an authoritarian political project. Back to the beginning, in order to conclude. Freud's sharp perception help us to understand that with collective cognitive dissonance, we are not dealing with mistake. That's clear. But we are also not dealing in the realm of illusion. This is a true problem. With the extremist media sphere and collective cognitive dissonance, we are rather brought into the heart of darkness, of delusion. In this circumstance, and only in it, the image which we started today may make any sense at all. This is the greatest challenge of today's world. Hate rhetoric that we discussed yesterday is the fuel of this hallucinatory, delusional machine.
Thank you, Professor Castro Rocha. We will proceed now to a first round of questions and comments. So please raise your hand and present your
Any criticisms as well, please.
Yeah. And we will be approaching the microphone. Cesar and then
Okay, my name is Cesar from Brazil. Thank you, João Cesar, for your excellent lecture. I have 2 questions. And yesterday, I asked you about memory. I asked if today we are a society no memory. So my question is, my first question, the mimetical theory can explain how we are forgetting of our memories. I'm talking about historical memories And because in Brazil, for example, we had dictatorships, and today we have Bolsonaro, and many people on the streets want a new dictatorship. Is a problem. But I talk again our recent memories, the pandemic, for example. In Brazil, we had 700,000 people dead for the pandemic. And many family members of these people voted to Bolsonaro. It's a big problem. So this is my first question. The second question is, today in Brazil, in the political theology, some people are using Carl Smith to read and understand the new fascists in Brazil. And because Carl Smith used dictatorship, sovereign, exception, what do you think about it? This is my second question. In the end, the great question is, bad memory is a good thing for a collective dissonance? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, question, Francis.
Yeah, of course, yeah, as we did yesterday.
Thank you again. It was, as yesterday, it was a really great presentation. My question, I have a comment and a question are kind of combined. Your discussion of the verticality of the hermeneutical phenomenon, it reminded me of my favorite hobby, chess. And in the world of chess, there's a lot of machine learning where pros mimic what machines do without even understanding why the machine does it. It's a sole act of mimicry. So I wonder how in this Girardian triangle, how machine and machine learning and the mimicry of the artificial intelligence complicates or nuances it. And the second would be the question of how virtual reality can nuance or complicate the idea of social media. I think in my mind, I see virtual reality as kind of the next evolutionary step in this digital universe, and how this can perhaps the mimicry within virtual reality, but also how this can compound hate rhetoric and this influencers that you were talking about. So I wonder what your thoughts would be on those two. Thank you.
Thank you first.
Hello, my name's Andrew. Thank you for speaking today. Do you think social media and mimetic theory has led to the increasing impatience and instant gratification of Gen Z and aspects of life outside of social media?
My name's Maddie. Thank you for your presentation. I have a question about, so you mentioned the role of desire in illusion and the role of, people trying to explore their own wishes. And I'm wondering how you would situate that with delusion. I know that it may not be directly related, but I'm wondering what role, if any, desire has in the relationship between this collective cognitive dissonance and delusion.
I'm Barrett. So I'm curious what role you see the institutions that supply some of these actual technologies playing, specifically in the modification of algorithms that surface certain kinds of content and not others, and specifically what kind of power dynamics, like how you would interpret the power dynamics there, and as potential agents involved with creating these polarized narratives. I guess I'm curious where you see that mediation coming in. I completely see the incentives that you suggest for why they're like Google, Twitter, some of these companies would create the kind of algorithms they do, but it seems like there's actually like potentially malicious actors involved in producing this. It's not merely on the recipient agent side there. I don't know if that's so much, maybe that's, I think that's a question. Yeah. I don't know.
Well, let me clarify, as I said yesterday, that I do not have answers, but let's think together, because I'm really trying to develop some of those ideas. So, Cesar, many thanks for your question. I think the issue of memory is really crucial. Franz Kafka has this wonderful note in his diaries. He says, people photograph things because they want to forget them. Which it seems an anticipation of our world. Memory is actually, I would propose, an elaboration of time. Memory is not automatic. It's always a selection. It's always selective. As, for instance, this historian that was very important in the 80s, Maurice Robert, in his famous book on the social memory, memory as a social construction as well. So memory necessarily implies a certain experience of time, and an experience of time, which means that you do not assimilate the experience as it happens. It takes a time. And memory is the elaboration of this time taken between the experience itself and what is going to be forgotten, what is going to be remembered. Ernest Renan has this very famous essay, which was a lecture given at Sorbonne, What is a Nation? And a very, very important lecture, because it was right after, a few years after the Commune of Paris and the massacre of the Communards. And then Renan said, a nation is composed above all, not by what we remember, but by what we have collectively decided to forget. And then he mentions the massacres in France in the 13th century. This is beautiful, because he could have mentioned the massacres happened 5 years earlier, 5 years previous to his lecture, but he goes back to the 13th century. So memory in that respect is necessarily an elaboration of time. It's not automatic, it's selective, and depends on the processing the previous experiences. There is one movie that comes to my mind, and then I come to Carl Schmitt as a wonderful suggestion concerning Carl Schmitt. It is moved by Wim Wenders. I'm not sure if you have seen. It's called Till the End of the World. Have you seen this movie? It's beautiful, isn't it? The protagonist is William Hurt. His mother, Jeanne Moreau, she becomes blind. And then he develops a machine which allows to register images. And he travels all over the world, registering images so that her mother could see once more. It is, by the way, a beautiful homage that Wim Wenders plays to the history of cinema. Right after the invention of cinema, the brothers Lumière, they invented a new profession. There was the hunters of images. It was a beautiful profession. They would go all over the world taping, let's say, the pyramids or Athens, and then they would show in Paris as a film. For the first time, they would see movement, those images in movement. So Wim Wenders is playing a homage to the very beginning of the history of cinema. He comes back to his mother, and he transports this machine he devised to his mother, and then she sees everything. But then he has a problem. He becomes literally paralyzed. He does not have any action any longer. He sits beneath a tree, and it's just a catatonic. Do you remember what happens at the end? You have seen the film, right? Remember what happens at the end? An old man comes and starts to storytelling, to tell stories. And then he comes back to life. I think this is a beautiful homage to cinema, but a beautiful homage to a very specific notion of time that I think we may be losing. Although, Francis, I'll come to your point afterwards, because it's a very important point. Perhaps I'm being nostalgic. It's a possibility. Carl Schmitt, it's very important. Wow. Well, I'm not sure if you know, but Carl Schmitt was perhaps one of the most brilliant minds in the world of law in the 20th century, wrote fundamental books, but he was a Nazist, openly so, and helped Hitler with the laws, with the anti-Semitic laws in 1933. The year before, 1932, he published a very important book to the contemporary world called The Concept of the Politics, the concept of politics. There, he has a fundamental concept. He says that there is a way of understanding politics. Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro, Viktor Orbán, André Duda, Rodrigo Duterte would not be possible without this understanding, says Carl Schmitt. This is a cordial politics. Cordial? Comes from cordis, from the heart. Because if politics is dominated not by reason or by projects, but by feelings and emotions, then the world of politics is no longer between adversaries, but between friends and above all, enemies. So the contemporary world is very much a world as it was envisaged by Carl Schmitt. So wonderful suggestion. I will bring, I haven't thought of it, but I will include Carl Schmitt in the book because I think that this distinction between friend and enemy helps a lot to understand what is happening in politics today, isn't it? The 1932 book. Thank you, Cesar. Francis, then let me come back to a point you raised, which is a very important one. But I'm not fully prepared to talk about it. So I'll just say 2 or 3 things, and then having a beer, we keep on talking. Every single new means of communication have changed, not as a direct change, but have helped to shape radically the world. For instance, Christianity is hardly conceivable without the book, without the codex. The new Pentecostalism is hardly conceivable without television and social networks. Islamism and Judaism are hardly conceivable without a very strong oral culture. When the printing press becomes really accessible, because the book was extremely expensive, it would be part of dowry of queens. You would have 2 kilos of sugar, believe it, was very expensive sugar, and 1 book. Only in the 18th century, the book truly became affordable. And that brought 2 fundamental cultural institutions. The novel found it was possible. Of course, the novel, Don Quixote, 1604. But between 1604 and the 18th century, you do not have the spread of the novel as a genre. You have to wait for the 18th century because you have to wait for the book to be available, to be cheap enough to be bought. The Nazi-fascism, it's almost inconceivable if you do not understand that they very smartly and very shrewdly, they took full advantage of the radio, of the cinema, of the modern technology. The transnational far-right political movements right now have taken place right now in the world. It's not conceivable if you do not understand that they have very shrewdly, very smartly, very intelligently, they have appropriated the social networks and the digital universe, the same social networks and digital universe that we, professors, intellectuals, we have despised for too long. So there are fundamental changes according to new media of communication. You are completely right. And perhaps virtual reality will imply an anthropological change for which we are not prepared. But we have at least to be intellectually open to the possibility that digital universe, social networks, and virtual reality will imply anthropological changes in the perception of time, therefore in the construction of memory, therefore in the interrelationships, in the intersubjectivity. So I'm absolutely open to that possibility, but I'm not yet prepared to really be profound on it because I don't have that much of knowledge, but I'm open to the possibility. But let's take advantage. I'll come back to the chess. Andrew, that's, I think, precisely your point. There are already studies on a new sort of syndrome. It is an anxiety syndrome related to the fact that you are always afraid to lose some news that have not happened yet, but you may lose them anyway because perhaps you're not connected at that moment. There is a fascinating example. If you're interested on that, I would suggest to you, you are undergraduate or graduate student, I would suggest a final work for you. Are you familiar with the genre of the epistolary novel? You don't have to. And it was a very important genre in the 18th century. It was a novel whose action actually was transmitted through letters and diaries. So the first novel in the British literature that was the reflourishing of the novel genre was a novel called Pamela, The Virtue Rewarded. It's like 1,200 pages, Andrew, but it's composed by letters sent by Pamela to his family in diaries. And the virtue is rewarded because there is a character called Mr. B. He's the villain. He's a wealthy man. They used to take advantage of all the poor girls that would come from the rural world to work in his mansion. He's a noble. But Pamela is deeply in love with Mr. B. But she knows that if she does not resist, she's just going to be another one. So after the whole first volume, there is the second volume where the virtue is rewarded. Mr. B marries Pamela. 1,200 pages of letters and diaries. Can you conceive of reading it today, Andrew? But the whole point of the epistolary novel as a genre was the exploration of time. You would write a letter, you would send a letter, the letter would come back. It is a commonplace is a rhetorical technical term that means something which is often repeated. A commonplace, the epistolary novel is you send a novel on November the 17th. Then you send another letter on November the 24th, and you say, I believe that I have not received my letter yet because I did not get an answer. So the epistolary novel was a genre of the exploration of time, but above all, was a genre in a time when anxiety was not a possibility. You had to wait the letter to arrive. So you see what I mean? So that, I think for your generation, would be a very interesting project to think the epistolary novel as this genre that explores time as a huge span of time available against today. Today, if we do not know, you take an airplane, you arrive. What is the first thing that 100% of the passengers do when the airplane is taxiing? They applaud because they are happy to be alive, but then after applauding, what do? They connect to the telephone to see what will happen. So I think there's a very important point, Andrew. And it's not easy to control. I'm an old man. I'm 57 years old. I'm an old man. I feel this anxiety. So I cannot even imagine what it's like for someone your age. But good luck anyway. Thanks for the question, Andrew. Back to the chess. Francis, we have to talk over a beer because I was a chess player in my youth. For approximately 4 or 5 years, I abandoned everything that I did in my life. It was a scandal, and I devoted myself to play chess. So I'm very fond of the subject. And you're completely right. In the past, when I was young, computers could not beat a world champion at all. That was just impossible. But why? Because computers could not learn yet. Computers, they were programmed. So the best way to beat a computer was to make a very awkward move. It would be out of his programming. The first time the computer actually beat a world champion was when the IBM, the Deep Blue, beat Garry Kasparov. But this is very controversial. I won't go there right now. But right now, there are computers like AlphaZero. The same happens in this extremely complex Chinese game called Go, which is even more complex than chess, if you believe it. They have computers that they are able to learn. So how does it take place? a computer starts playing. That happened in the Go. There is a documentary in which the Garry Kasparov Go loses to a machine, that the machine learns, plays 10,000 games, 1 billion games, and the machine itself perfections the programming. So this is a new world for computers that also ties with your concern with the virtual reality. So many thanks, but I have the plan of writing a small book on the duel between Garry Kasparov and the Deep Blue, because since I was not a great chess, I was only a reasonable chess player, but I was a chess player. So I think I have an understanding of what happened that some people do not have, because they actually don't play chess. So most of the people say that Kasparov lost because of one specific game. It's completely wrong. The truth is in the next game, but that would be too much. But many thanks for bringing the chess to our discussion. Did you understand correctly? Your name is Mary? Mary. Mary. I think it's a very good point, Mary. Yeah, because usually the way that I work, I read very carefully the authors, and I'm very fond of reading them carefully and respectfully. But I'm a very malicious reader. So in the case of Leon Festinger, I am convinced that what happens is that this final paragraph of the 1956 book had just left Festinger perplexed. How was that possible? Because the last paragraph, my whole work now is unfolding the last paragraph. Because the last paragraph says clearly, the prophecy spectacularly failed, and yet, given the publicity, but Mary, imagine, telephone calls, letters, interviews, today with social network. Just think of what Alex Jones was able to do with the InfoWars in spreading lies, spreading horrible fake news concerning the lives, the trauma of real people. Think about it. So I think that when he writes a theory of cognitive dissonance, I have the insight, I should not say I have the insight that he writes one book against the other. The whole book is against the last paragraph, because now he can say, well, cognitive dissonance is undoubtedly part of the human condition. And yet, also part of the human condition is that as when we are hungry, we have to eat. When we have cognitive dissonance, we try to diminish it. In some 3 or 4 pages in the whole book, he admits the possibility that you may enjoy the cognitive dissonance. What I'm trying to do with the collective cognitive dissonance, and you just hit the jackpot, precisely that. I'm trying to show that there must be a pleasure in delusion. In illusion is wish, is desire. There must be a pleasure in delusion. And it's very clear when you listen to people defending conspiracy theories. They had this pleasure to imagine that they know something that nobody does, only them. So I think it's a very good point. That's what I'm trying to do. So mistake, illusion, delusion. I'm trying to bring pleasure to delusion. There is a possibility that you may enjoy the delusion, but you may enjoy the delusion because for you, it is not delusion. It is a reality that only you were able to understand and figure out. So many thanks. Now, this very important question regarding algorithm. It's a very important question. I think there are 2 possible ways of thinking about it. So let's do it together. The first way, you're completely right. And even this scandal concerning Cambridge Analytica, I was trying to remember why we were talking. Unfortunately, I didn't. A very brave woman who was part of the Cambridge Analytica, she wrote a book in which she described how the whole process was engendered. Have you read this book? Oh, it's a very important book. There is also a documentary. I think it's Hacked Privacy. So she shows clearly that there is an agency, there is specific actors. There are powers involved in the algorithm is not only mechanical or technical. And what has been found recently by research made with Google, Facebook, and Twitter is that aggressive language, conspiracy theories, and radicalized content attracts views. So they favor the promotion of this content, not because of ideological reasons, but because of financial ones. The more radical, the more views. The more fanatic, the more likes. The more absurd the conspiracy theory, the more views and likes as well. That was the case of Alex Jones. In that sense, if you work with digital media, I think it's very important that you take a good look at the recent trial that convicted Alex Jones. That may be a change in that circumstance. First point. Second point, now let's truly think together. I have a hypothesis, and I'll try to be very brief. I think that what we can all understand the transnational rise of far-right political parties, and it's very important to acknowledge that they have won free and democratic elections. So either you like them or not, you have to be intellectual honest, you have to acknowledge that they have learned to conquer hearts and souls, especially from the youngsters. How does it happen? I have a hypothesis. I think there is a structural affinity which was not planned, and that's why it's even stronger, between the digital universe and the far-right political agenda. Is the following. Would you agree, but let's have a conversation so you can disagree, please. This is not a rhetorical question. Would you agree that given this enormous flux of ceaseless data information all the time, that without a system of exclusion, the digital universe would be entropic? It's algorithm. So the algorithm has to be seen as a machine which allows the ceaseless flux and the ceaseless novelty concerning data and information, because you already have a model for exclusion. So it doesn't matter if you have 1 or 1 trillion, 1 zillion trillion, you have a model for, yeah, please.
Having something that's functioning as a binary at its very base creates the conditions for greater exclusion and inclusion. And it allows for more colonialistic powers as well to take to become major actors.
Absolutely. It makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense.
And now, next step. How is the worldview of the far-right political movements? It is binary. It is algorithmic. It's an algorithm as well. It is, we'll come back to Carl Schmitt. It is me, my friends, and all the others are enemies, and therefore directly excluded. Second point, the so-called economy of attention was not invented by the digital universe. Always existed. Always existed. But would you agree that has come to paroxysm with the digital universe? Because of this gigantic offer, you have to speak louder. You have to be aggressive. You have to be ostensive. You have to find a way to become visible. Do you agree? How is the language used by the far-right political movements? It's the same. It is aggressive. It is ostensive. It is impossible to be indifferent, isn't it? Because they can be racist, they can be misogynist, they can be xenophobic, and they seem to have pleasure in being so, because they can always resort to the First Amendment. They can always say it's freedom of expression, isn't it? Third point, this is decisive. Third point, would you agree if I say that the digital universe has produced a revolution in the economics thanks to the digital economy, the so-called e-commerce or the e-economy? It is not by any chance that if you see right now who are the 10 men or women wealthiest in the world, almost all of them have some sort of connection with the so-called e-economy. Do you agree? What is it that the far-right political movements have done all over the world? They have brought the dynamics of the e-commerce into politics. They make money all the time. One single example, just one. Donald Trump lost elections, November 2020. What did he do immediately? He launched a fundraiser campaign because according to him, without money, he could not contest elections. Do you know how much he raised in 60 days? Because the Forbes magazine made a research. It is published, is available on the internet. In January the 31st, Forbes magazine. In 60 days, Donald Trump raised $255 million, exempt of taxes. What is the business that in 60 days has a net profit without having to pay taxes of $255 million? So the far right political movements, they have this structural affinity with the digital world. I don't think it has been planned. I think it was as the process went. Since they appropriated the digital universe for political purposes, there was this sort of accommodation, symbiotic relationship. Does it make sense what I'm proposing to you? Yeah.
I absolutely think it makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, an interesting addition would be to look at blockchain as a tool produced out of this particular
Oh, I see.
context.
Interesting. Yeah.
That is itself, if you look at how cryptocurrencies are operating as this kind of engagement with the technology of blockchain, which is simultaneity is so key.
Yeah.
That the ideologies behind cryptocurrencies that keep them going, that keep people consuming, that keep
Yeah, very good.
Ponzi schemes engaging people in.
Yeah.
It reproduces this, but it reproduces it because the primary digital environment you're describing.
Interesting.
I think that supports your.
Oh, I haven't thought of it. It's a very good point. May I include in my book? That's absolutely, it's a very good point. A very good point, yeah. And the simultaneity is indispensable for the whole process, isn't it? Very good, thank you.
But the reality of blockchain doesn't exist until the block is recorded.
Absolutely, yeah,
And that's what creates the value.
yeah,
The recording of the block. There's
Yeah.
nothing before, and what comes after is entirely inclusive of what came before.
I see.
And it
Interesting.
exists in that
Very, very good point. Thank you. Yeah. So that's what I'm trying to develop now, try to understand.
Interesting.
Of course, yeah.
Because not sure power, sovereign power particularly. I think extreme right or far right movements are, of course, managing this kind of narrative, but at the same time, there are other actors. Populist regimes, different countries, Venezuela, Mexico now, criminal mafias. They are also in some way controlling young population through these kind of narratives. Also rhetoric. So how could you probably expand or problematize the question of sovereign power related to controlling population, mass population through digital networks, right? So not only extreme right, but also other movements are in some way, and churches, of course, are sometimes in complicity with this kind of sovereign power. It's a new expression of sovereign power. So that's why political theology, I think we need to think critically about these interconnections. But what do you think about these other actors participating in the sovereign power today in Mediosfera?
Oh, thank you, Carlos. That's a very important point. I have neglected that point. You're completely right. I'm thinking now, why have I neglected? I think that because what Carlos saying is very important, because there are other places like, if you allow me to mention Mexico, but there are other places like Cuba, Mexico, Venezuela, Nicaragua. They are supposedly leftist regimes, but they resort to the same techniques. Absolutely. And the other mafia, the drug dealers, and also the new Pentecostal movements in Latin America, that they use the same. I think it's a very good point. But I think that the reason why I have given pride of place, I mean, not even a pride of place, I've exclusively concerned myself with the far-right political movement, is because we had in Brazil, I mean, we still have, but he lost the election. We still have in Brazil a far-right president real extreme, real extreme, with an agenda of destruction, a misogynist, racist, xenophobic, a destruction of Amazon. I mean, the last 4 years in Brazil were the worst of my entire life. And I have worked quite hard to publish books and to have a public presence to say clearly that this is not acceptable. So I think that actually I have not realized until we have said now, but I have exclusively been concerned with the political far-right movement, given the Brazilian context. But you're completely right. If I want to write a book which may be of interest to all the contexts than the Brazilian one, I necessarily have to include this mention that this is not exclusive, this usage of social networks, it is not exclusive to the far-right political agenda. You do have some progressive leftist governments, especially in Latin America, that are using the same system of disinformation. Nicaragua would be a case in point. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Nicaraguan case, but this has become a terrible, which has begun as the last revolution of Latin America. It was 1980 when the Los Sandinistas defeated a terrible dictatorship by Somoza. And it was at the beginning was the last revolution well succeeded in taking over power in Latin America. And at the beginning, there was great hopes concerning Nicaragua. But in the same leader of the revolution, 1980 revolution, Daniel Ortega, he has come to power, and now he's doing exactly the same that all the far-right politicians do. So it's a very good point, Carlos. I should necessarily include this in my final reflection. Many thanks.
Because I think that we are reflecting in this colloquium about the necropower on the different networks, with now including criminal mafias, talking about what we call in some places, and there is a philosopher in Tijuana, Sayak Valencia, feminist theorist. She used to talk about necropower and necro machine. So of war against women, against younger people, trafficking bodies and drugs or guns. So the interconnections among the mafias and the extreme right, but also populist regimes, I think it's important to think how is interconnected.
Yeah, so very good point.
That's the point. And so going back to Carl Schmitt, we need to rethink the new forms of sovereign power and producing their life.
Yeah.
So that's my question. I will be talking about tomorrow.
It broadens up my research.
Sure.
Absolutely. I agree.
I can compliment something. Sorry. For example, in Brazil, in Rio, where João Cesar and I lived, we have big problems, trafficking, and we have as militias, the militias. And the last election, for example, in our neighbors where João Cesar lived and I live, in northern and south, Lula won. But in the west of the Rio de Janeiro, we have the big power of the militias. And there, Bolsonaro won with a big expression. And there we have new rich people, but we have many favelas there. And people that live there were afraid to vote in Lula, for example, because it's dangerous for them, for their communities. This is a necropower in the mind, in the extraterrestrials, is dangerous. These are new forces of control of our society.
Yeah.
Yes.
Matt. Yeah, my question is sort of following up on Maddie's, but I think it's connected to the references to Carl Schmitt. And I'm really interested in this notion of like the institutionalization of cognitive dissonance and then sort of a communal socialization into cognitive dissonance. It seems to me that these things can kind of happen simultaneously. And the Carl Schmitt references made me think of the sort of the institutional role of cognitive dissonance in the rise of the Nazi Party and then the Second World War. So Netflix just released a version of All Quiet on the Western Front, Nicht Neues im Westen, the novel. And it's amazing. And cognitive dissonance and mimesis are everywhere in this as you watch it. Yeah, at a very high social, political kind of level. But I bring that up because at the end of the First World War, Germany surrendered, but the war never actually crossed over into the Germany itself. So you have an entire population that now lost a war that never even entered their homelands. You had a controlled media that kept saying, the war is going well, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. Now, of course, millions of Germans died, but they were being told they're dying for a good reason, that we're winning the war. And then one day, November the 11th, they wake up and they say the war's over and we lost. And so now there's this, you have to find someone to blame, you have to find scapegoats. And this is where you first start to see that rhetoric around elites, the Jews, the politicians, etc., right? And this sort of spirals and builds. And as the treaty, the Versailles Treaty, and the reparations put in against Germany take effect, you see an even further economic kind of suffering, in addition to then obviously the loss of life and all of these things. And it seems to me that the cognitive dissonance there is partly institutionalized through political parties and movements that have this insight that, oh, we can blame people. We need to blame someone for this problem because it's not our fault. And then on the other hand, you have socially like real pain and suffering that the population is engaging with. So I'm just wondering if we need to add like this notion of like suffering as well as desire into this question about cognitive dissonance, you know? And I think they can be related, right? Like there's a desire to limit one's suffering, but there is, I think sometimes it's a suffering that sort of potentially kind of gives cause to this cognitive dissonance as well, not simply a positive thing, but as another kind of negative thing. So that's one sort of dimension of this. Yeah, so I don't know if there's some sort of response or thoughts on that.
Hi again. I had an addendum question to Maddie's about desire and delusion. I wonder if you could speak about the role that comedy and entertainment plays within delusion. I particularly think about the election of Donald Trump. He wasn't the first far-right candidate, but and it's sad to admit, but he is definitely the most entertaining and comedic. He's absurdly fun to watch. His rallies are popular because he is a performer in a way that other far-right candidates weren't. So I wonder if the delusion is in part because of this comedic, whereas it was fun to buy into this, and compared to Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden, who are boring beyond belief. So I wonder what role, especially in a world of kind of, mass neurosis and depression and anxiety, that a comedic kind of messiah perhaps can be a delusional. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I have I do ethics, so my question is more future oriented and about the possibility of transformation of reality and of structures. And given that all these of social networks and algorithms are built by the same ideologies that are present in reality, are you hopeful about the possibility of changing the structures, and how this resistance is? So the first question is possible some kind of resistance? And my second question would be how this resistance would be or look like, if you think that there is some kind of resistance that is possible. Thank you.
There's a question.
So there's an online question as well from Rafael Cunha de Miranda. Professor João Rocha, somewhat recently, since the globalization came up with the so-called World Wide Web, which made humans beings all over the world keeping connected themselves, exchanging ideas regardless. So far, they are in the planet non-stopping way. And therefore, the simultaneity and the virtuality of the localization in the globe, whereas something that we ourselves, citizens of the 21st century, should try to develop skills to get used to, learn how to leading with the current media's characteristics.
Let me read.
Yes, please.
Just make sure that I'm going to be fair to Rafael. Let me see.
I did not understand that either.
Rafael, I know Rafael. He's from Brazil. I know him. Oh, Rafael, how are you? Thank you for watching. Wonderful. Yeah,
I probably did not read well.
yeah. Repeat the question, please. No, Carol.
It's a whole question.
Which Carol? Yeah, Carol, many times.
Well, somewhat recently, since the globalization came up with the so-called World Wide Web, which made us human beings all over the world keeping connected themselves, exchanging ideas regardless so far they are the planet, non-stopping this. And therefore, the simultaneity and the virtuality of the localization in the globe, where we are, is something that we ourselves, citizens of the 21st century, should try to develop skills to get used to learn how to leading with the current media's characteristics.
And I'll also ask you
Yeah.
a question and also a comment. So I don't know if you're familiar with what happened with the new constitution in Chile, but one of the main reasons that we lost the plebiscite, is that the English expression for it? For the new constitution, is that there was not political background, like political power. There were not enough hands to make the campaign in favor of the new constitution, right? That's one aspect. And the second aspect is these hands were needed because the amount of lies and fake news that went around were just like, it was a whole year of lie campaign. I'm not lying. It took a month after we lost the plebiscite for people to realize they were lied to, my parents including, right? It was a sort of media sphere around the constitution.
They found they had been lied to.
For example, a lot of people thought that they were going to lose their homes. And I think this is related with what Matt said, right? So it was basically two positions. The first one, that the constitution was gonna mess with the economy. And the second one, that it was gonna make people suffer more, right? And the main one, it was that they were gonna be taking their homes away. And many people did believe it. So, and this is connected with my second question. How do you think we can break the cycle of the media sphere? Because we could not do it. And I'm saying we tried. Yes.
Okay.
So let me start with Cesar. Cesar, I think that would be important just for our colleagues to understand that actually militia in Brazil, they are paramilitary forces. Because in the US, the militia, the notion of militia dates back to Benjamin Franklin. In several states in the US, it is legal to have militia, but the concept is armed citizens for self-defense. That's it, yeah. But in Brazil, when we call militia, actually we refer to paramilitary forces, usually former agents of securities of the state, that they just make extortion to poor people. They oblige them to use their services, so forth and so on. So the paramilitary forces in Brazil, as was in Colombia, Colombia had a very, very important paramilitary forces that that achieved the power with Álvaro Uribe, that was the leader of the paramilitary forces in Colombia. This is, I think, a very important issue that you are raising, Cesar, because in a country like Brazil, it's a very different reality from the United States. For instance, Rio de Janeiro, we are from Rio de Janeiro. In Rio de Janeiro, 50%, 57% of the population, they live in areas under the control either of the paramilitary forces or the drug dealers. So it means that for nearly 60% of our fellow Fluminenses, the inhabitants of Rio de Janeiro, they do not live in a democracy. Formally, they do, but in their everyday lives, they do not live in democracy. I think this is in the whole of Latin America. It's very important to understand why sometimes it seems that the people, they do not appreciate democracy as much as they should. But it's not that they do not appreciate, it's that in their everyday lives, they do not experience democracy. So I think it's a very important issue for Latin Americans. We have to acknowledge it. And then, if you allow me, that brings to one very important point raised by Matt, which is the suffering. The work that I try to do, I try as much as I can. Of course, I can't do that always, but I try as much as I can to have some sort of an ethnographical gaze on the far-right political movement. So we're not going to read any of my books. You don't have to, but you're not going to see me using adjectives. I try to have some sort of ethnographical description of how the dynamics work. And I think this is much more useful for the reflection and also for the public discussion, for the public debate. Why should you read my book if in the first sentence I say that the far-right political movement, they are such, don't even read this book, right? So the far-right would not have become a transnational successful movement without the actual suffering of hundreds of millions of persons all over the globe. For instance, here in the US, 2008, the terrible economic crisis. The system spent this unimaginable amount of money to save the financial system. They had good reasons for. The same money was not used to help the ones who lost their houses because they could not pay mortgages any longer. Europe, with the European Union, there are great advantages, but there are real disadvantages for specific groups that cannot compete any longer in this globalized market, so forth and so on. So you do have a growing number of people who are actually suffering, and they have good reasons to be resentful. And so when a political party promises to be anti-systemic, I'm anti-system, I am anti-banks, so forth and so on, although this is not true, it's a very powerful rhetoric. So I think that we cannot understand truly the transnational impact of the far-right political agenda, because since we are from the intellectual world, we only see the far-right political agenda from its worst side, xenophobic, racist, misogynist, so forth and so on. And we have to criticize, this is not acceptable. But for certain people, what they represent is some sort of a anti-system voice that we know is false, just like the lies that your parents and your friends were led to believe. But there are real people actually suffering with certain movements of the so-called globalization of the economy. You have several industries that disappeared, like in Chicago, the automobile. It is happening all over the world. And so I think this is very important to consider if we are going to truly have a ethnographical understanding of the rise of the far right. Another issue that you raised, which is very, very important, I would just try to establish a comparison. Let me know if that makes sense to you. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power and Joseph Goebbels became his most powerful minister, Goebbels created a project. As soon as he arrived in power, It was called the People's Radio. You know the project, don't you? And the Goebbels, the idea was that he would help the industries, giving money, if necessary, to produce very cheap radios so that everyone virtually could buy the radio. Next step, everyone who bought the radio was obliged to listen to the programs by the Führer. 1994, Rwanda. A man called Félicien Kubaga, who is now in jail, arrested for crimes against humanity. A man called Félicien Kubaga, a Hutu, buys a radio station, RTLM, and finances a cultural magazine, Kanguru, and buys also some sort of satellite system so that would allow this radio station to be spread all over the country for months, endlessly, without any stop. There was this terrible attack on the Tutsis ethnic group. Some months later, Félicien Kubaga gave the final step. He imported to Rwanda approximately 500,000 machetes, if you believe it. And for months, it was the most terrible killing of the end of the 20th century. That would not have been possible without this radio station. I don't want to be simplistic. In the whole process, having bought the radio station, have acquired a satellite, it was absolutely indispensable, as much as Hitler's usage of radio, cinema, and all those things. So I think that here, it's a very good point that you raised concerning the institutionalization of collective cognitive dissonance has to be related to one question that you raised, which is paying attention to the actors. It is not simply an outcome of the digital media, and not simply the way the algorithms work. You do have political agents behind those movements. So many thanks for your questions. Francis, that's a very good point, but it's a dramatically good, actually, because one of the strategies used by the political far right was actually to replace politics with entertainment. Well, not only the political far right, Zelensky, now Ukraine's president, he was an actor who had a very, very popular sitcom in which he was president. Then he became a candidate and he won. The Italian movement Cinque Stelle, which was the first Italian movement that took full advantage of the social media. There was a clown called Beppo Grillo, a genius. The Italian Stephen Bannon looked for Beppo Grillo and developed a whole strategy to make Beppo Grillo a national figure, and he became prime minister. Donald Trump, without the apprentice, you are fired. Without this orange tonality of his skin, without this unbelievable hair, he would not have the same charisma. Bolsonaro in Brazil, he is well known for speaking a very particular Portuguese, and to have some sort of a behavior that supposes an authentic behavior. They are entertainers. You are completely right. They are entertainers. But this is a problem. So we have to characterize and understand. And your point is very well made. But this is a problem because the true agenda is to depoliticize the polis. This is a true agenda, is achieving political power through the depolitization of the polis. How to do it? You replace politics with entertainment. Politics is not supposed to be fun. I'm not expressing myself properly. If you're talking about, let's say, Brazil, we have at least 3 or 4 dramatic problems in Brazil. I'm just mentioning 2. The destruction of the rainforest. This is a universal problem. It's not a Brazilian one. During the 4 years of Bolsonaro's government, the destruction was unbelievable. We are close to the point of no return. The victory of Lula was important not only to Brazilians, was important to all of you. The inequality, social inequality. With Bolsonaro's government, Brazil has returned to the so-called hunger's map. It is the FAO's, the ONU's institution. They have a map where they locate where the hunger is in the world. We are back to this map. We were not there for the past 15 years. We are back. We have in Brazil today, they say, the institutions, the research agencies, approximately 33 million people in Brazil. They go to bed every night with hunger, not having eaten enough. So those problems are not supposed to be dealt with in a fun way. They are terrible problems. So you see, so this is, but I think your point is very well made. When replacing politics with entertainment, it has always been an authoritarian project. So 1930s, 1920s, Benito Mussolini is a deputy. He only has one man that actually levels him up and is superior to him. He's a man who is ugly, small, has physical problems, but he's a genius. Antonio Gramsci. What was Benito Mussolini's strategy in the parliament was to make fun of Gramsci all the time, referring to his physical difficulties, referring to his voice, referring to his appearance. It did not work because Gramsci was far superior intellectually. So Benito Mussolini left aside entertainment and put Gramsci in jail for until little before his death. So, but it's truly happening. It's a very important point. Now I think Valentina and Martin. Oh, and Carol, if you are there, many thanks for your question. Let me address Carol first, because in Valentina and Martin, there is a common issue there. Carol, I think that Carol's point relates to your question, Francis, concerning virtual reality. I think Carol has a very good point. I do not want to sound nostalgic. I'm not looking for a golden age that never was. But I do think that Carol is completely right. We do have to acquire new skills in order to interact with the contemporary world. We have to do it. There is no option, even from an intellectual standpoint. We have to do it. So I completely agree with Carol. We do have to learn those skills. But at the same time, if you do not have to be nostalgic, we do not have to be employees of the present. That is to say, we do not accept anything which is now taking place is not necessarily positive. We may be able to acquire the skills, but still be critical of certain elements of the digital universe, as I'm trying to be. To finish, because you are tired, I apologize. I do not want to get that much tired. Valentina's and Martin's question, there is a common point. How to face it. Let me give just one example. The current president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, that was his third attempt to win the presidency. He lost in 2006. He did not lost. There was fraud. He won the elections, but it was given to another candidate, Francisco Calderón, that he clearly won. In 2012, he lost to Enrique Peña Nieto, a politician that had his image built by the most important TV network in Mexico, Televisa. But please correct me if I'm wrong. And the campaign against López Obrador by the TV networks, by the elite, by the middle class, in the social networks, he was ferocious. The campaign against López Obrador. Few politicians in Latin America have been so much attacked for so long as Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So he lost the two elections. He just had one shot. He created a political party, Morena, Movimiento de Regeneración Nacional, the Movement of National Regeneration. And then in 2018, that would be 2018, right? Yeah, 2018, 2006, 6 years. 2018 will be the new presidential campaign. I was in Mexico right after his victory, and I had a very good, long conversation with one of his main assistants in communication. What did they do? In 1216, Morena created a program of voluntaries. And the program was the following. It's important to know that López Obrador is evangelical. He's truly evangelical. So he adapted an evangelical technique to politics, but in a good sense, I would say, which was, there was a campaign door to door, puerta a puerta. And so young people would knock at the doors, would introduce themselves and say, hi, me llamo Juan, y quiero enseñar, si me permite, quisiera hablar con usted por 5 minutos. In Mexico, everybody's so hospitable. They open your house, offer coffee, a cake. It's a wonderful thing. And so they would talk to the housewives, to the people, to the workers, would show the WhatsApp. It would show how fake news and how lies would circulate through fake WhatsApp. In the campaign, they adopted humor against this political campaign. So, for instance, they would say, López Obrador, because they said in 206 that López Obrador was supported by Nicolás Maduro. So in 1218 that he was supported by Vladimir Putin. Then the Mexican supporters of López Obrador started to make jokes. I would say in Spanish, but you're going to understand. So they would say, so Putin supports López Obrador. So they would say, Putinovsky, Nyakapukovsky meets López Obradorovsky. So they start to make fun. Every single fake news, they would turn into fun. They took 2 years of this process, but they visited how many houses? It was like the whole country. So there are things that can be made. So go ahead, Martin, please.
It's actually very interesting because I was part of the presidential campaign for UERJ.
Yeah.
Before UERJ was elected, and we were losing in every single, when they asked the people, I don't know if they yeah, we were losing in all of them. And we won because a month before, I actually think it was 2 weeks, there was an organization of young people that brought an incredible amount of volunteers.
Yeah.
I remember only in my block, it was like 3 or 4 blocks, we were over 500 people meeting that have never been political volunteers before. We were just doing it so that we could be passed on the election.
Yeah.
So I agree with what you're saying.
Oh, say. So, yeah, so we're all going to have, okay, so Valentina, I do have hopes. I'm hopelessly optimistic, but I think that's going to take lots of work. I think that we will have to start to be present in the social networks. I'm going to create a YouTube channel to offer classes for free. I'm not going to charge anyone. Offer classes for free. Carlos should be in the social networks. We have to be in the social networks. We have to create alternative possibilities, alternative communicative systems. Will take very long. It's not going to be easy. They have much more money than you do. They are there for at least 10, 15 years. But listen, we were able to beat Bolsonaro in Brazil. It was a very tight election. But Bolsonaro had this machine of disinformation lies. We won. But now we have to do, it's not just a matter of winning elections. We have to win hearts and souls. We have to work. But I'm hopelessly optimistic. And I think that literary reading and literature will help us tremendously. Many thanks for your attention and for your patience.
Thank you so much. You can see we were improving a kind of laboratory of ideas. And that reminds me a little bit what Achille Bembe is doing in Senegal. Every year he gathers a group of scholars, artists in the Satellite de Dakar, the workshops in Dakar. And it's a kind of process like this one. So thank you so much, Professor de Castro Rocha, for this opportunity. And we expect that we can continue the conversation. Please, let's continue working together. And you have new colleagues here in Boston College. Thank you very much.
Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you.